Hello, it's Aaron here at the Battle of Preston Pans Museum in sunny East Lothian. I hope you're having a fantastic summer. I'm sorry that it's taken so long to get this video together. I've had messages from friends and followers asking if I would ever get round to it. The truth is, it's been a very busy time here at the museum. We're a very small team and we've had lots of temporary exhibitions and events, and we're having a great busy summer, counting down to our Battle of Preston Pans reenactment event, which takes place every 3 years and comes round on the 21st and 22nd of September. So if you're thinking of being in the Preston Pans area, that's the time to be here. But in the meantime, let's give some thought to what we learned in our What If interactive wargame campaign, which we began all the way back in January 2023. Now, if you can remember this far back, we began our campaign on the 21st of September 1745 on our historical timeline, and that was the day of the Battle of Preston Pans. We imagined the battle had just happened, and now it was over to us to decide what to do with the Jacobite army. By us, I mean the Facebook followers of the Battle of Preston Pans Heritage Trust, because it was on the Facebook page there that the public could vote on strategic, crucial decisions. The campaign itself ended on the 10th of June, which is the date that our prince finally escaped into exile, having taken ship in the northeast of Scotland after his final defeat at the Battle of Blair Castle. Let's just remind ourselves then how our campaign played out. All of these actions marked on the map took place on the tabletop here in the museum, a pretty busy tabletop it was. And I've given lowercase titles, of course, to the smaller skirmishes and capitalised the bigger battles. Initially, there was a phase of consolidation by the Jacobites. They opted to lay siege to Edinburgh and Stirling castles initially, time-consuming, but allowing them the chance to consolidate in Scotland. That created the environment where small skirmishes at 7 Mile Bridge and Ardasir, and then a larger one at Glasgow, allowed for that consolidation and took away the options for large-scale recruitment by government loyalists within Scotland itself. Marshal Wade tried to put the pressure on by crossing the border from Newcastle with his army, but his cavalry were defeated at Sutra, and then in a pretty grueling and rather enjoyable tabletop battle, he was defeated at Dunbar. The Jacobites then chose not to follow historical precedent and head down the northwest of England from Carlisle. Instead, they stormed Berwick-upon-Tweed and headed down into the northeast of England, laying siege to Newcastle. By this time, though, the long sieges of Edinburgh and Stirling had allowed enough time for the Duke of Cumberland and veteran forces from the European front to move into the south of England, and these rushed up, hoping to relieve Newcastle. They didn't make it in time and had to retreat back into County Durham, pursued by the Jacobites and ultimately defeated by them at the Battle of Spennymoor. Cumberland went scrambling for the coast, took a ship and managed to sail himself round to London to help his father in the defence of the capital. It seemed everything was going well for the Jacobites. They marched down through Yorkshire into the Midlands and headed towards the capital. Meanwhile, the French, seeing the Jacobite successes, had sent a large expeditionary force to the southeast of England. But of course, with a large force in London between the French and the Jacobites, it was very difficult for the latter two to actually communicate and coordinate. So we ended up with the French desperately trying to create a bridgehead across the Thames, trying to force their way through Tunbridge, whilst it was held by the newly arrived Hessian forces who'd come to salvage the wreckage of King George II's campaign. But at Sandridge, George II himself was able to hold the Jacobite advance. Although he wasn't decisive in defeating the Jacobites, he certainly stopped them from marching directly on the capital. And he took out a number of significant Highland regiments, which reduced the aggressive fighting power of the Jacobite front lines. The Jacobites moved round to Oxford, linked up with the French, and then wondered what on earth they were going to do to actually bring this war to an end. And the decision eventually was that to try and draw George II out of the defences of London, they needed to take on a high-value target, and they marched south to threaten Portsmouth. This did draw George out. There was a cavalry action at Guildford, driving off the French horse, and then a major action at Petersfield, which saw the Jacobite army defeated. Driven away, the Jacobites began to suffer great difficulties as they began to retreat, not sure what their strategic options were now looking like. They faced rearguard action at Littleton, which saw further damage. They were, however, able to break away from their pursuers and head across the Midlands and head back up towards their garrison at Newcastle, which they stripped and abandoned, and then fell back on Edinburgh. Meanwhile, there had been some upset in Scotland. There had been a loyalist rising in the south west of Scotland, which had succeeded in retaking Berwick upon Tweed and causing some disruption. But that was all resolved largely by the re-emergence of what was left of the main Jacobite field army. But after a brief moment of consolidation and recuperation, stripping all of the Jacobite garrisons that were available to recoup the losses that had been made, the Jacobites went back into the north of England, hoping to stop Cumberland coming into Scotland. That led to a major action at Belford, another Jacobite defeat, and this time it was all the Jacobite army could do, frankly, to keep itself together. It retreated into the north under hot pursuit and eventually was finally and irredeemably destroyed at the Battle of Blair Castle. Gosh, quite a succession of actions and an important series of events, different types of battle. And as you can see from the map, now I'll point out here that I confess I got the labels the wrong colours. I should have had Jacobite victories labelled in blue. Instead, for some reason, I've inverted the colours and Jacobite successes are labelled in red. So you can see the Jacobites did well overall, but all of their victories were in the first half of the campaign. And once they were in the south of England, when they were facing larger forces, when the government had all sorts of advantages in its speed of raising militias to resist them, then things started to go wrong. So the question for the campaign really was why? How did the Jacobites manage to turn a situation that looked so positive into a defeat? Certainly a big issue for the Jacobites was the problem with replacing Highland soldiers. The benefits of the Highland units, their terrifying charge on the battlefield, meant that you naturally wanted to use them on the battlefield in your front line. And they could be very effective, but they could also be exposed to heavy fire during the course of an action, and any reduction in their strength was very difficult to replace. Once the army was deep into England, it was almost impossible for new Highland recruits to get down to them. So that was a big issue. Even winning victories, the Jacobite army was slowly diminishing in its aggressive power on the battlefield. Now, one of the things that we have in this campaign is a series of charts to help determine the outcomes of battles, which units are able to recover to which levels. Basically, structured out, it means that even victorious armies get weaker as the attrition of war continues. You replace that with bonuses for localized recruitment, but that's not always recruiting men of the same caliber, and in particular, you can't recruit Highland soldiers in the north of England, for example. Another situation the Jacobites were facing was, of course, the depth of reserves that the British government had available. First, Cumberland's army was able to come across from Europe in a succession of staggered waves, and therefore it could replace the losses inflicted on Marshal Wade to an extent. Then there were the Hessians who were able to come in as well in support. There were also the Dutch, although they didn't play a part in our campaign because, as was historically appropriate, as soon as French troops landed in support of the Jacobites, the Dutch troops had to be withdrawn from Britain. The English also benefited from a large recruitment of militia. Although not especially strong units, they were units that could be recruited, especially, for example, when French troops arrived in the south of England. We had it arranged that that would trigger some patriotic fervour in the south and trigger a lot of recruitment bonuses for militia units in the area. So it was easier for the Georgian government to replace its manpower, although, of course, that's how we ended up with a large militia proportion in the British Army towards the end and far fewer regulars. They couldn't keep replacing regular regiments that had been lost. Now, we had a number of different styles of battle during the course of the campaign. Big open engagements like Spennymoor, but also urban environments, We had bridge crossings that had to be fought over, some very unsuccessfully. We had encampments that got in our way. We had castles that had to be blasted and burned, and we had natural obstacles containing and compressing our battlefields too. We tried to make all of these issues as realistic as possible, and that meant that we did make some changes to the rules. As I'm sure you're all familiar with if you've followed the campaign, we used Black Powder 2 gaming rules for the tabletop battles, but we did make a series of house rules that went on top of these that were enable us to have a little bit more flexibility, and were able to create a little bit more sort of realism in some of the actions. We're going to look at developing some of these and writing them all up too. In terms of the physical management of the campaign, there's no two ways about it. It was a time-consuming process. Although enjoyable, there was a lot of hours had to be put into maintaining the daily logs of exactly where each force was and trying to keep track of how far apart they were. And that influenced, of course, how quickly they would come together, whether an army would arrive in time to be able to relieve another force. I wanted to keep this a real-time campaign, and although we did have to admittedly stop the clock every now and again and catch ourselves up, we kept that flowing pretty effectively. As you can see, I also had a grand campaign map that was on the wall of the museum here, which allowed me, in pretty old school technology, to keep a track of everything that was happened. As this got more complex as the campaign wore on, I would have to clear bits off in order to march new armies over old tracks, and that's where the daily log diary of all the previous movements became very valuable, because it meant that I wasn't losing any information about what had happened previously. I decided for the video reports that I wasn't going to give you all of the minutiae of all of the decisions and movements because, frankly, it would have made the videos very long and potentially very tedious. In the same way, I decided not to give turn-by-turn or roll-by-roll accounts of the battles in the battle reports, trying to give the narrative of the bigger picture. But I can assure you all of the decisions were openly made, properly gamed, and none of this was predetermined and driven by a desire for a particular outcome. We tried to keep everything as open and natural as we could. Now, at the beginning, before we started the campaign, I did put together a series of campaign rules and built into it a number of triggers for when certain thresholds were met, certain events might happen, particularly in order to determine things like the intervention of the French. And I deliberately didn't share those milestones because I didn't want them to influence the decisions that were being made during the course of the campaign. Inevitably, as the campaign went on, and I'll be honest, I wasn't sure we were going to get past a couple of months before we all lost interest or moved on, and perhaps nobody would be watching, so nobody would notice. But as the campaign went on and continued to generate interest, it was clear that we were going to come across new scenarios or unforeseen situations, and so there had to be a little bit of flexibility then in making new rules for new situations as they were encountered. We also have encountered a number of sort of nuances as the campaign developed in terms of recruitment, and so we ended up bolting new rules into the set, so that after the initial setup, which was simply breaking Scotland and England into two areas each, Highland and Lowland Scotland, Northern and Southern England, and also Wales, although Wales didn't come into the campaign in the end. We also started to introduce more sort of repercussion events, so that a victory would increase the likelihood of successful recruitment rolls in that turn. And recruitment rolls generally took place twice per month. I always tried to ensure that there were, if there were strategic decisions made that had not been foreseen, then there might be a repercussion to it. For example, when the British team asked me if they could use naval reserves to help evacuate some troops out of the north of England, then that was possible, but it led to an increased possibility on the rolls to determine French intervention on the basis that naval resources were being redeployed and potentially a gap opened up. So there are all sorts of mechanics built in there. Now, one of the reasons that I started this campaign in the first place was because, as a Jacobite historian and the curator of the museum here, I'm constantly being told that if the Jacobites had just done this, or if so-and-so had done that, then the outcome might have been different. So this was an opportunity to see whether that was really true. The map here shows the location of the skirmishes and main battles of the 1745 to 46 campaign historically. You can see they're not exactly following the pattern of our campaign. There's lots more action in the northeast of England and flowing through into the south of England as well, because our campaign saw our Jacobites penetrate deeper into England. Historically, the Jacobites got as far as Derby, 120 miles from London, but a long way short of the St Albans battlefield that our Jacobite campaign essentially lost its momentum upon. One thing that is clear, though, is that the same general process happened. The Jacobites were more successful in the first half of the campaign, but slowly, as the odds and the resources against them built, they started to struggle as the campaign went on. The Jacobite army's defeats all occur within the late stages of the historical campaign. The big difference really in our campaign is that the French did finally land, and they sent a large-scale expeditionary force. You could argue that in our campaign they didn't necessarily use it particularly well, but the crucial learning was that the French in the south and the Jacobites north of London had a very difficult time communicating effectively between each other. We tried to reflect that by not giving our Jacobites control over the French forces in the south of England, and so they had to either react to what the French were doing and try to keep up with them, or to try and operate separately. So that was an important and I think illuminating set of challenges that emerged. The other was, of course, the sheer scale of the resistance in terms of the numbers of soldiers that George II was able to deploy as the campaign went on, meaning that he could recover from reverses much easier than the Jacobites could. Having said that, things were on a knife edge, and George II came very close to seeing his capital seriously threatened. And one does wonder if historically there would have been some serious political and economic repercussions for the Jacobite army having been able to spend so much time unopposed moving around central and southern England. So I think there were interesting historical parallels, and I do think there was some value in the campaign from that perspective. So here comes the, I suppose, crucial point. What was the point? Why did we do the What If interactive wargame campaign? Why did we do it the way that we did it? Well, first and foremost, the Battle of Prestonpans Heritage Trust, which is a very small independent charity which doesn't own the battlefield, but does operate a museum here in the former town hall of Prestonpans and has set up interpretation points around the battlefield area, is always looking for new ways to engage with people and get them talking about the Jacobite story. And one of the reasons we started our campaign with the victory at Prestonpans was that we wanted to see what might happen in the immediate aftermath if different decisions had been made from this point here where I'm sitting. So hopefully we've done that. We've reached out to new people who we hadn't previously been talking to. We've had some really interesting conversations as we've been going, and hopefully we've triggered some interest in some of you in the Jacobite Wars, even if it wasn't an interest already. That isn't just it, though, of course. It was an exciting and enjoyable project. I have a huge debt of gratitude to pay to, firstly, Dave Smith, and secondly, Brett Fletcher. They were the keys not only in actually operating the British government forces and their strategic decision-making, but crucially in making and painting the models as we've gone along. They will be able to tell you, if you were to ask them, of many times when I would suddenly message them and say, look, I need a British fleet, or I suddenly need another round of militia. You're simply recruiting too many men. And without them being willing to take the time and the commitment to produce those figures, which I hope you'll agree look fantastic and have really served the campaign very, very well. it simply wouldn't have been able to succeed the way that it has. So I'm very much grateful for them, and to the support of the Battle of Prestonpans Heritage Trust, who were able to allow me to use part of my time here at the museum to commit to the campaign. And the question that I know you're going to ask me next is, well, where do we go from here? And the answer is that we're going back to the beginning. We're going to start the campaign again. We are going to have another run at 1745, but there are going to be some crucial changes. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, we're changing sides. Those who ran the British government responses to the Jacobite campaign last time are now going to run the Jacobite army. And the public are going to be able to influence the decision-making of the British government forces this time. So we're swapping around to see if some of our own inbuilt strategic prejudices might have had some impact or influence on the direction of the war. Secondly, we're going to begin at the start of the campaign historically. We're going to begin on the 19th of August 1745, when the Jacobites raised the standard at Glenfinnan and summoned the clans to arms. And that means that the decisions made by General Cope before the Battle of Prestonpans will now be able to be under scrutiny. Is it worth marching your forces into the Highlands and sacrificing the protection of Edinburgh, or should the campaign be fought completely differently? So there's a new set of questions that we can ask about how the first part of the war, before the Battle of Prestonpans, might be affected by different decisions. There are also a number of other tweaks. Some of the in-game mechanics that we evolved during the course of the campaign, and some of the house rules for gaming, we're going to now apply right from the beginning, rather than adding things in as the campaign goes on, because we've learned through the process of having played it out. And there are little things like house rules that will turn the turns into actual periods of time, which will allow for a more dynamic form of reinforcement and relief on the battlefield, things like that. Hopefully you're going to enjoy it all the second time round as well. We're hoping for a different style of campaign. We may well see some engagements in the same areas, who knows, but we're hoping to have just as much fun going through it all again as we had before. And let's see whether different people making different decisions might come to a different outcome. I hope you're going to join us on that journey as well. The final thing that I'm going to commit to doing as much as we can, just because we don't feel this campaign was ambitious enough as it was, we're going to launch our campaign on the 19th of August next month, and we are going to try to keep our timeline in exact parallel with the historical dates as we go. So let's see if our Jacobites can change their trajectory. They were defeated in 1746. They were defeated in What If, the first interactive wargame campaign. Can they this time succeed in What If number 2? We hope you'll join us. I'll see you next month.